At the beginning of William Gladstone's second administration, an Egyptian nationalist movement led by Ahmed Urabi, known as the Urabi Revolt, began an effort to overthrow the Khedivate of Egypt, a tributary puppet state under the Ottoman Empire. Since the Ottomans were so politically weak at this point, they relied heavily on British and French investment and military support to maintain their empire. So the revolt against the Ottomans was seen as a larger revolt against Western powers. When it started to look like the Khedivate would be overthrown, the British sent their Mediterranean naval fleet to bombard the port of Alexandria to protect British-owned property. After the bombardment weakened the defending Urabi tribes, or rebels, excuse me, the British launched a land invasion of 1882, beginning the Anglo-Egyptian War, which they decisively won within 3 months. After their win, the British promised to depart Egypt after order had been restored and return it to the Khedivate, but they would go on to continue to occupy Egypt for the next 70 years. While the French had supported efforts to thwart the Urabi revolt, they were unpleasantly surprised when, following the conflict, Britain seized absolute control of the Suez Canal, dealing a major blow to French business interests. Also in 1882, while visiting Ireland, a group of liberal politicians were attacked and stabbed to death by a radical Irish nationalist group called the Irish National Invincibles, which itself was a splinter group broken off from the larger Irish Republican Brotherhood once the group made it clear that any efforts for Irish independence would have to be postponed. The assassinations, now known as the Phoenix Park murders, named after the city park in Dublin where they occurred, gave the Liberals further mandate to suppress the freedoms of the Irish and made independence seem like even further away of a goal. Gladstone's second administration was absent of any notable progress in domestic policy, with the one exception being the Redistribution of Seats Act of 1885, which specified that congressional districts should be relatively equal in population size and not just by geographic size. Back in 1820, the Khedivate of Egypt had invaded and conquered Sudan, bringing it under their control. Seeing the weakness of the Khedivate, Islamic rebel leader Muhammad Ahmad led a group of his followers to lay siege to the Sudanese capital of Khartoum. Ahmad and his followers considered him to be the Mahdi, a figure in Islam who is expected to come back to earth in the end times to clear the world of sin before Jesus returns. The Mahdists were able to take control of Khartoum, at which point Gladstone ordered the British governor of the Sudan region, Charles Gordon, to withdraw British soldiers from Sudan to spare bloodshed and expense for a region with little strategic value. He also ordered the evacuation and abandonment of Sudan by the Khedivate forces, since he believed they would ultimately be defeated and that the expenses incurred to try and defend their garrisons would prohibit them from being able to make their interest payments to the British government. Gordon believed he understood the Mahdists' goal better than Gladstone because he understood the seriousness of the Mahdi, and he believed that after taking control of Sudan, the rebels would try and go on and take control of the rest of the Muslim world. Further, he believed the Khedivate soldiers stationed in Khartoum would be enough to fight back the Mahdists, and he delayed the evacuation to try and maintain control. He made a critical mistake, however, in letting his Sudanese tribal allies know that the Khedivate forces were evacuating, and the tribal leaders lost confidence in the Egyptians and British and switched their allegiance to the Mahdists, making the current predicament even worse. This loss of support overwhelmed Gordon, and after 10 long months, him and his garrisons were overrun by the Mahdists, who killed all the besieged men, including Gordon, and enslaved all the women and children. During this entire period, Gladstone was reluctant to send an expeditionary force to rescue Gordon's party, which was in contrast with the public opinion, which believed Gordon should have been rescued. After almost 10 months of siege, Gladstone finally agreed to send troops to Khartoum, but he was too late by 2 days, and the rescue party was forced to retreat from Sudan. Gordon's initial assessments of the Mahdists ended up being correct, and the rebels would go on to establish their own Mahdist state and subsequently began the Mahdist War, which saw them invade and conquer neighboring territories. Gladstone's inaction was seen as a major failure, and he was forced to resign, being followed by conservative Robert Cecil in 1885. Despite Cecil's weak position in government, he pushed to draft legislation supporting the working class, passing the Housing of the Working Classes Act, which put the onus of maintaining safe dwellings on the landlord, requiring safety inspections prior to executing a lease. His liberal opponents jumped on this bill to paint Cecil as a socialist who was willing to do anything to appease the working class. Gladstone, seeing an opportunity for his return, had his son put a press release out announcing that he would now support greater self-government for the Irish, with this piece becoming known as the Hawarden Kite, named after Gladstone's home, Hawarden Castle, and the fact that the article was an instance of journalistic kite flying, a term meaning to put out an opinion piece to gauge public reaction. This bombshell moved supporters of Irish independence in Parliament to switch allegiance from Cecil to Gladstone, toppling his government and paving the way for Gladstone's return. Once back in office, Gladstone worked to try and pass the promised legislation for Irish rule, but this created an outcry within the Liberal Party, causing it to split, with the conservative faction of the party going off to form the Liberal Unionist Party, which would ally with the Conservatives over issues pertaining to Ireland. This schism would bring Gladstone's third administration to a quick close, and he was once again followed by Cecil after a few months. In 1887, Cecil worked to sign the Mediterranean agreements with Italy and Austria-Hungary, which agreed to cooperation in the Mediterranean Sea. The treaty was brought about at the behest of Germany, who wanted Britain to become a closer ally in the fight against Russian and French expansion. In 1889, he passed the Naval Defense Act, which allocated additional funds to increase the size of the British Navy. The previous policy was that the Royal Navy had to be 33% larger than the next largest navy. But now Britain was determined to grow the Navy to be the size of the next two largest navies combined, a policy which came to become known as the two-power standard. This expansion marked the greatest growth in the Royal Navy in a time of peace. At this time, Britain's longest-running ally, Portugal, was aiming to connect their African colonies of Mozambique and Angola by a land bridge, which their claims shown in a map called the Pink Map due to its rose coloring. This land corridor would cross the territories of what is today Malawi and Zimbabwe. While neither territory were formally claimed by a European power, the British had a presence, had a presence in Malawi for several decades, since British missionary David Livingstone led an expedition there in efforts to spread Protestantism and end the practice of slavery still being conducted on the African continent. His party of missionaries would go on to establish the trading city of Blantyre, named after his hometown in Scotland, which is today the capital of Malawi. British ties to Zimbabwe were first established in the year prior by influential businessman Cecil Rhodes, who aimed to build a country in his name based on mining natural resources. He also had an ambition to create an African transcontinental railroad called the Cape to Cairo Railway, which aimed to connect British Cape Colony with Egypt. These British interests were in direct confrontation with Portuguese interests, and in 1890, Robert Cecil issued the so-called British Ultimatum to the Portuguese, which demanded they cease all activities in Malawi and Zimbabwe or face military action, something the Portuguese grudgingly agreed to since they were much smaller than their larger ally. In 1892, Dadabhai Naroji became the first non-European to run for parliament. Naroji had been born in India and became a British appointed official within the Raj. He was ethnically Farsi, which meant he had a light-skinned complexion, and thus he was seen as popular amongst the British public, who saw him as one of their own. The Farsi were the original residents of Persia, who followed the religion of Zoroastrianism, but who were forced to immigrate to India following the Muslim conquest of Persia. In India, they had held a degree of power as a minority group and were seen as a natural ally of their British overseers. Naroji had subsequently moved to Britain to run for Parliament, where he was disparaged by Cecil, who referred to him as black and not worthy of representing the British people. These remarks caused outrage among the Queen and the Liberals, and Naroji ended up winning his central London district, and Cecil was forced to step down, being followed once again by Liberal William Gladstone in his now fourth premiership. Gladstone would once again make passing a bill on Irish Home Rule the centerpiece of his legislative agenda, this time pushing the effort through the House of Commons. When his bill was stopped dead in the more conservative House of Lords, Gladstone felt that his defining effort had been defeated. At an elderly 84 years old, he decided to retire from his position following the defeat, and he was replaced by fellow Liberal Archibald Primrose in 1894. Gladstone enjoyed 4 years of retirement with his wife before passing away from old age. In 1894, the Ottoman Empire was still reeling from their defeat in the Russo-Turkish War, and Sultan Abdul Hamid II became increasingly worried of the prospect of uprisings within the empire. The Armenians, who had always been considered second-class citizens in the empire, were increasingly being discriminated against to curtail their freedoms. This policy backfired, and radicals founded the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, which advocated breaking away from the Ottomans and joining the Christian Russian Empire. Hamid II's reaction was to create his own private cavalry called the Hamidiye, which meaning belonging to Hamid, made up of Kurdish and Circassian mercenaries, which he used to terrorize the Armenian activists. Despite the pleas of European governments to stop terrorizing the Armenians, including from the British, Hamid II ordered the Hamidian massacres, which saw the Hamidiye kill 200,000 Armenians, dismantling the revolution and quashing any hope of freedom. Public opinion turned against Primrose, who they believed had failed to diplomatically stop an ally from genociding a Christian minority. While he supported active military intervention against the Ottomans and a turn to a closer alliance with Russia instead, many liberals who were caucusing as liberal unionists believed such a policy to be too radical, and they voted to end his government in 1895, allowing conservative and now liberal unionist member Robert Cecil to return to power. In this year, a border dispute between Venezuela and the territory of British Guyana reached a boiling point over a contested borderland called Essequibo, which had recently been obtained newfound importance after the discovery of gold deposits there. Cecil planned to settle the conflict by sending an armada of British battleships to intimidate the Venezuelans, but this did not sit well with the Americans, whom President Grover Cleveland believed the Monroe Doctrine covered, meaning the Americans should have ultimate say on how the conflict is resolved since it occurred in the Western Hemisphere. Cleveland used the issue for political gain in the upcoming election, causing American public opinion to turn strongly against the British, who they saw as an evil colonial power. This public pressure and threat of American intervention was enough to convince Cecil to instead seek resolution through international arbitration, a decision which Britain won, allowing them to maintain Essequibo. Also at this time, Britain wanted to solidify its control over the Dutch Boer republics of Transvaal and the Orange Free State, which were parts of South Africa not under control of the Crown. The Boer republics had been founded several decades before by Dutch settlers who wanted to escape the confines of the British-controlled Cape Colony to farm independently. The British had failed to extend their control over the republics during the First War, but the territory now took on new importance with the discovery of gold and the major rush that ensued. The Boers, who were small in population, relied on British workers known as Uitlanders to settle in the Transvaal to work in the mines. Powerful Baron Cecil Rhodes had an interest in the development of these gold mines, and he personally hated the Boers' nationalist leader, Paul Kruger. So he organized a cavalry raid into Transvaal to disrupt the government and begin an uprising of the Uitlanders. The raid, now known as the Jameson Raid, after its leading officer Leander Jameson, was a spectacular failure. The embarrassment impacted an earlier 1890 treaty between Britain and Germany, which sought to solidify the British African possession of Zanzibar in exchange for German control over the strategic Baltic island of Heligoland. The Germans had not been fully pleased by the treaty, which stifled their own ambitions in Africa, and in 1896, Kaiser Wilhelm II sent an infamous telegram to Paul Kruger, congratulating him on his defeat of the British, known as the Kruger Telegram. The telegram caused the British to believe the Germans were increasingly setting themselves up to threaten British rule, and in response, the British moved their forces from Egypt into Sudan, which was an area the Germans were vying for control against the Mahdist state. While moving into Sudan, the British encountered a French expedition party at a location called Fashoda on the Nile River. Since the British outnumbered the French 10 to 1, they were able to easily force the French to cede their claims of the territory. This event humiliated the French, but also began convincing them that they needed to ally with the powerful British if they were to stave off German expansion. By 1899, Robert Cecil had become incensed that the British did not control the South African gold and diamond mines, and he forced a meeting with Paul Kruger in Bloemfontein, the capital of or the Orange Free State, to discuss giving the Uitlanders more rights, including the right to vote, and setting the official language in the Republic as English. Kruger outright objected to these asks, and in response to the collapse of the conference, British soldiers were dispatched to South Africa, beginning the Second Boer War. Since the British greatly outnumbered the Boer soldiers, the Boers relied on guerrilla warfare to damage the British morale. Instead of folding to the pressure, the British stepped up their attacks and took a scorched earth policy, which included rounding up 100,000 Boer women and children and placing them in concentration camps, where a quarter of them ended up dying from disease and starvation. The plight of the Boers drew international condemnation of the British, although they would continue their heavy-handed tactics since the public at home supported the war and its nationalist sentiment. The British were able to defeat the Boers in 1902, leading to the annexation of the republics and creation of two new British colonies, Transvaal and Orange River. The end of the war also ushered in a trial against 6 members of the Bushveld Carbineers, a specialized British mounted infantry unit which was found guilty of war crimes against Boer civilians and POWs, resulting in their execution. At this time, Cecil's health was deteriorating, as well as his wife's, who ended up passing away from illness. Cecil saw this as a sign to retire from the premiership, and he was followed by his nephew and fellow conservative Arthur Balfour. Cecil would die shortly after his retirement after an accidental fall from a chair he was sleeping in. Cecil's final administration had been dominated by foreign policy issues, which garnered large swaths of public support. Despite the Liberals being opposed to the Second Boer War, the Conservatives were still widely popular at this time.